Paladins. Fantasy's stand-in for the Holy Knight. These guys are indicative and important to everything from tabletop role-playing games to video games to stories. In a lot of ways, they play the roles of fantasy cops, holy knights, and avengers of the gods, but the truth is, no matter how you slice it, you deserve a better paladin. Hello, my name is Kyle for Desks and Dorks. We do historically themed role-playing game content, indie RPGs, and all of that stuff, and I do genuinely believe that you deserve a better paladin. Before we get started, a couple of things. If you want to help us out, all of the YouTube pleasantries really do go a long way to helping us, but do you know what else you deserve? You deserve a modular game with rules, supporting things like housing and romance. You deserve a way to pick from 400 different character skills, and you deserve a game made entirely by human hands with no AI. That's right, our video today is sponsored by Setting Off, a TTRPG that reached out to me about this sponsorship. And I gotta tell you, you guys know that when it comes to sponsorships for the channel, I'm very picky. I have to at least try the game, or at the very least read the rules before I recommend this to my community. Before I could even get that out, I was provided with quick start rules, not one, not two, but like 4 character archetypes and a full press kit for this game. If you're interested in a game like this with simple to learn rules, very little math, so it's super intuitive, and a wide range of possibilities, I would highly encourage you to go check out Setting Off, which is in the description below. Again, a huge thank you to their team who reached out to me for this sponsorship. Like I said, I'm very picky about the stuff that I let sponsor the stuff on our channel, and this one impressed me so much right out the gate. They were direct, they were professional, and the project looks absolutely amazing. So if you're interested, check it out in the description below. But on top of that, of course, you can help us out. You can join our Patreon, where for $3 to $10 a month, you can help support the content that we make. You can get digital copies over at itch.io and physical copies from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Now, with that out of the way, what are we discussing? One, I want to talk about the origins of the Paladin, because I feel like that's an important thing. It's my favorite character class, other than like Druid and Cleric. So, like, obviously, clearly the dude who wanted to be a priest at one point in his life loves some of this stuff, but I want to talk about its role in pop culture and history, and how to make it more interesting based on the things that we learn, and the roles that the Paladin would have performed historically. I think that's a great place for us to start, because the Paladin deserves more, and so do you. But like any good story, we have to begin with the beginnings, and like so many things in the Middle Ages, and thus the things that would go on to inspire fantasy role-playing, it starts with the fall of Rome, baby. That's right, if you're filling out your obligatory Desks and Dorks bingo cards, your medievalist is starting with the fall of Rome. But it's true, when the Roman Empire fell, it left with it a massive power vacuum that some, in fact, by some, I mean most, of the new powers in Europe wanted to fill, and there was perhaps no greater one that wanted to fill this than the guy who would go on to become king of his own empire, a man named Charlemagne. Charlemagne saw himself, or at the very least allowed others to see him, as a successor to Rome, so much so that he was actually crowned, obviously, by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, and he did this intentionally. He wanted, although his empire had very little to do with Rome at all, nor would his successors have very little to do with Rome at all, but he wanted them to be seen as Roman as a form of legitimacy. Now, this is important for us to mention because during Charlemagne's reign and the battles that he fought, he would talk about his own fortress in the same way that the Romans would refer to the armed area, or the armed walls, settlement area around their governing buildings on the hills of Rome. This hill fort was called a Palatine, and from Palatine we eventually get Paladins, which refers to the knights in the Palatine. Again, he wants to like hype up his own connection to the Roman Empire, and later this evolves into Paladin in 1592. So the word itself is actually one that is loaded with a ton of both religious, cultural, and ultimately political meaning, and it carries a lot of weight. And the cultural, the religious weight that this word carries is reinforced because the knights that were called Paladins or Paladins were no slouch. Charlemagne assembled a Los Angeles Lakers style roster of professional killers, warriors, soldiers, and just dudes who were willing to squabble with steel. These guys included Roland, who by most accounts is our first depiction of the pop culture knight in human history, at least in the Western world, and all of these guys were willing to get down against absolutely unfathomable odds against some of the most dangerous individuals in all of Europe. So again, these aren't like random run-of-the-mill soldiers, they're not even regular knights. These are the elite of the elite, the ultimate bodyguards of Charlemagne himself, the Palatine walls, even when Charlemagne is outside of the castle itself. These men were, again, the Los Angeles Lakers, the Kobe and LeBrons of actual medieval murder. They are an incredible force to be reckoned with, and part of the reason that the word Paladin has continued to survive even unto today. But it does beg an important question. Where do we, in the fantasy role-playing genre, get so many tropes of Paladin from? And I think there's a lot of this. I think the first one has to do with chivalry and the chivalric code of virtue. There was an expectation that a knight was supposed to perform a certain way. However, you and I, especially if you've watched our video on knights where I kind of take the whole group to task, know that this is essentially just church propaganda, and your average knight isn't going to do that. However, the Catholic Church was the medieval age's best marketers, and because of that, we have this image that the chivalric hero is one that carries on forever. Religion is perhaps the most important aspect of the Paladin in fantasy role-playing, and this one is not overhyped. This one is, in fact, pretty true. The majority of knights, especially in the age of Charlemagne and later on into the Middle Ages, would be religious. They would specifically be, for the most part, Roman Catholic, if you're looking at the medieval knights in Europe. And this was not something that they paid lip service to. This was something that was a core tenet, both of their upbringing and seen as a core principle, a core pillar of how they acted in the secular world. It also helps that for many of these individuals, the church was not just a source of quote-unquote inspiration, but also a way to gain land and power by fighting for God himself. And lastly, again, we've talked about chivalry before, but the chivalric code doesn't just cover how to treat women and the unarmed, it also governed how you treated your fellow knight. It's part of the reason that paladins, at least in fantasy media, seem to treat each other with a modicum of respect. Remember, it is in the Catholic Church's best interest to prevent these knights from just, absolutely murderizing one another. And lastly, speaking of things being in the interests of the church, combat for the church is another big thing. The idea that these individuals in fantasy RPGs are being trained by an established hierarchical organization like the Catholic Church is as essential, I think, to their roles as characters as their own individual faith is, right? It's not just that paladins have religion. If they have religion, that's fine, but there are monks and clerics. There are individuals that walk the faith walk in all manner of ways in tabletop role-playing. Their service to and training that they receive from a hierarchical organization, usually one modeled on the medieval Catholic Church, let's be real here, I think is equally as essential and important to their core identity within the fantasy role-playing landscape. But what about their powers? There are so many powers that seem to be wrapped up in the idea of the paladin. Where do those come from? And I've really kind of boiled this down to two major categories. And the first one is healing, right? Whether we're talking about World of Warcraft, which I played a Divine Retribution Paladin in Burning Crusade, it was amazing, or again, the Paladins of tabletop role-playing, healing winds up being a huge thing, and this one has less to do with real historical events and more to do with the aforementioned religious aspect of Paladins in general. If you look at the Paladins' suite of abilities, these are clearly inspired by the miracles of Jesus Christ as depicted by the New Testament. Jesus manages to revive the dead multiple times in the New Testament, including the daughter of a Roman legionary named Jairus, as well as, you know, Lazarus and then himself. Well, I mean, that's a pretty obvious inspiration for Raised Dead. Jesus cures the blind and the leper. Well, I mean, come on, that's just curing a status effect, right? And one of the most overlooked religious miracles of the New Testament is Jesus curing a woman with hemorrhages when she just touches the hem of his robe. And that's a pretty obvious allegory for just straight up healing magic. But what about smiting? If you play a certain role-playing game, one that features a 20-sided die, for example, you are probably very, very much thinking to yourself, Kyle, where does the smite come in? I like the holy smite machine. How do smite? Where do smite come from? And that is less New Testament and far more Old Testament. And perhaps the greatest example of this is Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a lovely Old Testament city that gets what we like to call an area of effect smite when God decides to vibe check all of the citizens. Again, the idea of bringing down holy wrath is as Old Testament as the idea of healing the sick, the lame, the poor, and the downtrodden is as indicative of New Testament values. Remember that most of our fantasy games started as war games based on medieval factions and medieval values, and as a result, at least for me, it seems like there's a pretty clear through line here between the depictions of Catholic miracle, myth, and legend, or faith, and the way that a paladin is portrayed in fantasy media. And it actually winds up getting reinforced by popular culture. I don't know if this is as load-bearing a memory as anybody else, but did anyone else read the Caldecott award-winning St. George and the Dragon Slayer book when they were in elementary school in the 90s? Or is that just me? I feel like I saw this in like every US public library. But St. George and the Dragon Slayer is a good example of a pop culture knight, a pop culture paladin, so much so that he actually, again, revives himself after being, you know, vibe checked by the dragon. Ivanhoe is perhaps the greatest example of a pop culture paladin that we will have in the last century. Ivanhoe was in fact such a huge inspiration that not only did this character go on to spawn the titular book, several successful movies, but he's also the reason that Maryland, the United States, or one of the states in the United States, that Maryland's official state sport is jousting. I'm not even joking. That is how much antebellum landed gentry in the American South and in the border states of the American South prior to the Civil War loved the idea of knighthood. Ivanhoe was the best-selling book in the American South several times, and as a result, those sort of chivalric things wind up actually playing a role in Southern culture at the time of the Civil War, and again, are part of the reason that jousting, yes, jousting, is the state of Maryland's official sport here in the US. That is absolutely wild if you want to go and look at the impact that a pop culture paladin might have. And again, another example, perhaps the first, the OG example, is our boy Roland from the Song of Roland. This is one of the earliest legends and depictions of a knight in battle. This predates Arthurian myth and legend, and before we had Excalibur, we had Roland's incredible sword Durandal. Again, all of these are examples of how the legend of wholly inspired knights, elite soldiers fighting for an organization blessed with divine powers, would go on to inspire both history and pop culture, but also, through those influences, go on to inspire our tabletop role-playing games. But earlier in the video, I said that you deserve a better paladin. So what's my issue here? Why do I think that the popular depiction of paladins, at least in modern RPGs, kind of sucks? And I do think it kind of sucks, and it really has to do with what I like to call the Flanderization of the paladin. For those of you who don't know, Flanderization is the phenomenon by which a character or a character archetype is inevitably boiled down to its base components and thus removes all of the nuance that comes with that character. And again, there's a lot of stuff that the paladin kind of gets wrong, or the depictions of the paladin get wrong. A lot of times they're depicted as stuffy, boring, they're just like the rule follower or the fantasy RPG cop basically, which is not at all how they would have functioned, and not only does that do a huge disservice to the Paladin, but also to alignment systems in general. But I think the biggest thing is a lot of people tend to treat them like smite machines and little else. They are combat first or combat oriented to the point that it sort of denies or eschews every other part of them as a character archetype. It makes, or at the very least sands away, the more interesting bits of what it means to be a paladin, and ultimately it's one-dimensional. I love hitting people with big pointy sword or big heavy hammer as much as the next guy. So much so that I continue to do combat sports now into my 30s. But let's be real here for a second. They are more than a ball of meat, they are more than a rule follower, and they are certainly more than just the ability to smite. And if you're going to use paladins in your RPGs, I think our big watchword is going to be nuance. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how these characters would have functioned in the real world, and I want to tie them into my games. To do that, we're going to be returning and going back to a reoccurring character in this video, somebody who's going to help us out. I'm talking about my boy, the big man, JC. And so we're going to lean in, instead of things like smiting, returning attempts, instead of divine spells, we're going to lean in on what I like to call miracle points. Think of these like a meta currency that is unique for your paladin, no matter what system you are playing. Remember, we here at Desks and Dorks make system agnostic videos. So if you want to use this for something like Flayo, Shadow of the Demon Lord, Dungeons and Dragons, or perhaps our sponsor Setting Off, you could do that too. But again, I want to focus on giving paladins something unique that they can then trade in for a sort of divine blessing. They'll get miracle points from doing a number of things. Worshipping is a thing that will give them miracle points. I think it's essential for faith to be a not just forward part of the paladin's identity, but a critical, load-bearing, crucial part both to the character's identity and to the archetype itself. And engaging in religious ceremony and religious tradition should get your paladin some extra miracle points. You want them engaging in that core part of the character fantasy. I also think that legitimately there needs to be a desire in the paladin to help protect the weak, or at least to live up to those chivalric virtues, even though historically I know that the paladins in real life didn't exactly do that. I do think there should be some impetus and incentive for your paladins to help seek out and assist the downtrodden and the needy. And finally, I think it's really important, just like the paladins of the Palatine helped Charlemagne to establish a kingdom, or just like the Palatine was a fortress of an important area in Rome, I want to give paladins miracle points when they establish or dedicate holy sites. These could be shrines, but they might be other things as well, and perhaps different orders of paladins will have the ability to dedicate different types of holy sites depending on what kind of campaign you're going to be running. With that out of the way, one last thing, how many miracle points you want to establish and what players can do with those miracle points is ultimately up to you as a GM. However, I've got a couple ideas for how I think that would work right now. And as promised, we're going to lean into three parts of the historical identity of the Paladin, and we're going to get the obvious one out of the way first. The Paladin, historically, would have been called upon to fight in battles, and of course, in something like a crusade. And if we're going to talk about any of the Crusader Knight orders for this particular one, we're going to talk about the medieval equivalent of Black Air Force Ones, the Teutonic Knights. The Paladin as a Crusader accrues miracle points by slaying. This could be monsters, but ostensibly, I think you should probably give it away for the destruction and unalivement of human soldiers. They're also one of the few types of paladins within our miracle point system who can only dedicate a holy site after a certain number of individuals has been slain in the immediate vicinity. This encourages the paladin to have a certain playstyle. For once, the paladin is the one who is encouraged to be like, I really will send them all to God and then let him sort it out, because that's how they gain their abilities and the benefits. And the benefits are pretty big. Once they've got a site dedicated, they can get bonuses when they're fighting around that site. They accrue miracle points passively every day just by being near the site that they dedicate through violence, and they can spend miracle points for all of the standard stuff that you would expect: attack rolls, damage buffs, assistance, all of that stuff. all the things that would matter to a combat-focused paladin. But now that we've gotten the other stuff out of the way, I want to focus on or address the idea of the paladin as bodyguard. Remember, Charlemagne relied on the Palatine knights to protect himself when he was out on campaign or doing business of state. And I love the idea that these are warriors who are literally just there to protect an important individual. That's how they get their benefit. Think of these not just like tanks as in, let's go roll up towards the front lines, but as people who can spend those miracle points to do amazing stuff. I love the idea of being able to spend miracle points to switch places with another character instantly as a way to react to things like spells or oncoming attacks. They can also just flat out reduce damage or even prevent poison or status effects from affecting those around them. This is indicative of the kind of paladins that would have worked as the bodyguards and professional shields of important members of state. But lastly, we have to talk about the fact that for many paladins, the service that was being done was not service being done on the battlefield. It was service being done to the lowest of the low, the people who needed it the most. This is exemplified by the Hospitaller, the Hospitalier, if you want to pronounce it either way. They're my favorite knightly order, and they actually were responsible for the protection of pilgrims, but also for establishing hospitals and pharmacies, which they actually got some help from their Arabic contemporaries in the Holy Land in order to do this. So one of the things that I think you could do for this particular one is that, yes, they get their miracles, their miracle points by giving medical aid, but what I love is that they dedicate holy sites that are actually functioning. So a hospital could be a holy site if the paladin as servant is the one doing it. A chapel that provides medical aid or food could be used as a holy site. So these are not just places of worship, these are places to assist. And I love the idea that the paladin as servant can actually just counterspell things like unholy abilities or disease-causing abilities at will, in addition to curing them and getting the additional bonuses to stuff like healing. I thought that was kind of boring. I just love the idea of some giant eldritch abomination lifting its hand up to throw pestilence onto the world, and some paladin just looking, snapping their fingers, and just going, no. Because God, that's why. And then just striding into battle. I think that's absolutely amazing. Before I leave you, however, here are some core takeaways that I think are going to be really helpful to you as a GM if you're going to try to lean on paladins as more historically inspired and more, again, I think more nuanced and interesting than they've been portrayed in modern games. Faith first is a huge one. I don't think you can rip away the paladin from their faith or the faith from their paladin and be left with something even equivalent to what it actually would have been like to fight as one of these holy knights. I think you should have faith be a core aspect, both in terms of roleplay and in terms of the abilities for a character if they want to walk the paladin's archetype. I also think it's important for us to address that paladins were vastly important in their communities. The position of paladin came with all of the privilege and status of something like a knight, but also was wrapped up in the systems of governance that a paladin would serve, whether that is the church or a secular authority like a king, like Charlemagne, for example. These are not just regular knights, these are in many cases the elite of the elite, and may even be members of state or of government, depending on how that kingdom or that system works. And lastly, I think organization is hugely important. We touched on this with the way that paladins fight for a church historically, but there's a huge difference between something like the military orders that would have fought in places like the Crusades in the real world. These had secular authority, their own kingdoms, and secular responsibilities to go along with it. But there's a huge difference between them, between monastic orders. So for example, maybe this is a paladin dedicated to a life of contemplation and worship, and a massive difference between those and your local parish. Perhaps there is a small church serving several different rural communities, and the paladin just happens to be a part of that. All of those different organizations look and feel vastly different than one another, and as a result, those paladins should feel different their roles in the communities should be different, and their attachment to faith and the people around them is probably going to differ greatly as well. I think if you take those three things into account when you're crafting your own paladins, you're going to be left with something that feels both more nuanced and more interesting, but also one that feels more holistically built in to the world that you're trying to create. As always, however, this brings us to the end of the video. If you want to help us out, joining our Patreon is a fantastic way to do that. For $3 a month, you get your name in the credits, and for $10 a month, you get a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else, and I won't sell anywhere else. You can only get them by being a patron. If you want digital copies, itch.io is the place to go for those, and if you want physical copies, you can check them out from our friends over at Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Before I leave you, however, I want to let you know there is, as always, a Q&A section at the end of this video where members of the Desks and Dorks Discord, or the Desks in Discord, ask me questions about history and the related topic. This time, obviously, these are questions about Paladins. If you want to get in on that process, you can join the Discord in the link in the description below. But before I leave, I want to thank my amazing patrons: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Stefan Brosseau, Solution, Alex.VKSH. Folks, you're all absolutely amazing, and I couldn't do this stuff without you. So, thank you again. I'm Kyle Lott for Desks and Dorks. As always, you have been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dadbod. We did it. It's a Q&A section. Again, this is a much less scripted time. This is a time for me to just record this part of the video and have a conversation with all of you, my fine members of the Discord and on the YouTube community page. Y'all are great. With that out of the way, let's talk about some Paladin questions. Alien Dragon XLII asked, does smite make right? Yes, I suppose, given the context. I don't know. I think I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. Smite does make right. If you're smiting somebody, they have to be evil. So you know what? That's it. Twin Steel, what's up, buddy? Asked, what is the best real Paladin? And I'm going to give you two answers, Twin. I'm going to say the best real Paladin, or the closest thing to a real honest-to-God Paladin that we have, is probably Sir William Marshall, the Lance of Christendom. He would be a great example. Khalid ibn Walid is a great example of a Muslim Paladin, a Paladin of Islam. He is probably the greatest example of that. The Sword of Islam. It's pretty hard to beat either of those two, I think, for real life ones. And the best fictional one is the Doomslayer, who is a Paladin. I don't care what anybody says. The Doomslayer is a Paladin. I feel like that take has gotten less hot now that the Doom the Dark Ages game exists. So, Apprenticed, what is the origin of the modern Paladins trope? And is it true that it starts with the 3 Hearts and 3 Lions book? Is it actually with the Paladins of Charlemagne? Yes. Most of the time it was with the Paladins of Charlemagne. That is the best way that I can find it, at least insofar as how we describe it in modern parlance. I think you can make the case, Apprentice, that you could use the 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, but again, there's literally just that sort of lineage stretching back to Charlemagne, and then I think that's where it comes from. Were the Knights of the Round Table Paladins? I would say, yes, yes-and. I think you could make the case that Galahad from the Knights of the Round Table was a Paladin, and that if, there was a Paladin who shatters their oath, Lancelot is probably the best example of that. So I would say some of the Knights of the Round Table were Paladins, but not all. Were they just fighters or warriors? Yeah, some of them were fighters and warriors. I think of Gawain, who's my favorite of the Knights of the Round Table. But to your point, were they no better than your average, Landsknecht or other warrior? I would say, assuming that, we're judging the fictional characters of the Knights of the Round Table against, your average combatant, I would say they're far, far above. From the legends that we have read, almost every member of the Knights of the Round Table was a fighter par excellence, which would be my thing. Cadme, do you consider Inigo Montoya a Paladin, despite not fitting the typical TTRPG model of one might look like? That's a great question. I think, Cadme, it depends on how much you want to include the religious angle. I would not count him as a paladin, because in my mind, and when I'm thinking about like the paladin archetype, I'm really trying to lean into the idea of this religious identity and religious hierarchy as it pertains to fighting. So I would say no, probably not. However, I suppose you could theoretically, right, allow him to sort of have, maybe the righteousness, his fury, his religion, is in retribution for his dad, is in the pursuit of justice. Those are very paladinly things. So I don't know if it's as much of a stretch as some people might think. I would not consider him a paladin, but I don't know if I would boo-hoo if you or somebody else considered Inigo Montoya a paladin. It's a great take. I'll be thinking about that one for a while, actually. But my gut reaction right now is no. Ripley asked, I know the term comes from Charlemagne's Knights. That's true. In that context, what are your thoughts on paladins who aren't tied to religion, but rather to some other form of oath or bond? I think that's a great idea in concept. I think if, you're going, obviously we just talked about Inigo Montoya, but like he makes an oath to himself. I think that's a really cool concept. A mind over matter paladin. In that case, like Rock Lee from Naruto is probably a paladin, right? Because that oath to himself to train as hard as he does, that's actually so freaking sick to think about that. I like the idea. I think if you are, especially if you're leaning into a world where like there aren't gods, like, I think that would be like, I'm sorry, by the way, from like my sinuses, my allergies are kicking my butt. But I think that like would be a really good, interesting take, right? I love that concept and idea. So I think I'm on board. Even if it's not a traditional paladin, or even how I would have outlined a paladin here. I don't necessarily disagree with that. On that note, what do you think makes a good paladin oath? And what are your thoughts on creating character-specific oaths as a way of encouraging a character along certain action, such as a criminal being forced to swear a paladin oath as part of their rehabilitation? So there's a lot to unpack here due to divine wrath if the oath is broken. So let's start historically. Like the traditional oaths that were sworn, particularly by like mendicant orders in the Catholic Church, are poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? So your obedience is to the church hierarchy at large, but also the vow of obedience is an understanding, an implicit understanding that you serve at the behest of the community, which I think is important. Poverty, you cannot serve God and also money or material goods, and so I think that's probably a really important thing to take into account. So there's that, and then obviously chastity, you can't bang anybody. I think those are probably a good solid foundation to build on, because I think ultimately, right, if we're looking at paladins as extensions of an existing religious order, it's really important for us to consider what the purpose of an extension of that order would be. And in the paladin's case, serving both the hierarchy of the church and the greater community around it is pretty crucial, I think. Or to quote mendicant Franciscan friar that I met from Brooklyn once, when he was asked to sum up what his vows were, it was no money, no honey, and God's the boss, which I still love to this day. So I think it's a good place to start. In terms of character-specific oaths, one of the things that I would encourage is a conversation with a player to sort of like hone in on like what they're hoping to get out of their paladin, because this is one of those times that like I love being a collaborative GM, because I think if you take the time to like hone in and really dig in with that player what their expectation is and what they're hoping to gain from making a paladin oath, that's a really big thing. I would love to do that, and I would like, you could start making it general, which I think is what you should do. That's what a lot of monastic orders do. Like the poverty, chastity, obedience is a general oath, but like for example, Orthodox monks have very specific vows. Like some of them sequester themselves away in nothing but prayer, and like basically not starve themselves, but deprive themselves of food and water for long periods of time, right? The ascetic orders are what we would call them. And so like they start with the general vows, and as their devotion and their role grows, their vows grow both in severity and specifics. So I think that's a pretty good way to approach it. The last part though, I don't think I would ever allow a criminal to take it. Well, maybe that's like a good villain angle. The idea of an oath though is that you must enter into it willingly, right? Like part of the core fantasy about a paladin in general, whether we're talking about them historically or even just in the parlance of modern games, is the power comes from a genuine divine connection, and the genuine divine connection comes as a result of the character consenting to sacrifice certain parts of their daily existence in exchange for a greater connection, both to whatever deity they serve and the community at large. So I think ultimately that's a cool angle for like a villain character. Maybe there's a villain who is forcing the condemned to swear paladin oaths, which would be really sweet, actually, the more I think about that. It's almost like a Suicide Squad kind of thing, where it's like, instead of the bomb collar, you have like the oath hanging over their head. You could call it a Damocles oath. Oh, that's really sweet. All right, I might steal that. Damocles oath, baby. Nobody take that one. Nobody take that one. That's mine. That's mine. Listen, I put you all on free game. I get to do that one. I get one for me. Every now and again, I get one for me. All right, that's it. That's so sick. Okay. But I think hopefully Ripley, that makes some sense. Loxodon Prince, what's up, buddy? It says, if Paladin powerful, then why French? Can love that. I mean, technically speaking, they weren't French yet. They were Frankish. So there's more Proto-Germanic and and like barbarian than it is French. So I think that I'm gonna say they're not quite French yet. Although, like, come on, like, as much as I like to dunk on the French, and good God, do I love to dunk on the French. I say as somebody who has multiple French friends and who like has worked for a French company before. It's not like I do genuinely love the French, at least the ones that I know. But you got to dunk on them a little bit. But yeah, I would say they're more Frankish. Also, what is a paladin's place mechanically and narratively in games and stories outside the classic RPG, Dungeoneer, and Arthurian archetypes? I think it depends, Loxodon, on what role you place, or how much importance you place community building and communication in your RPG. I think one of the cool parts about Paladin is that, like, that they occupy this, like, really interesting space within, like, a community, right? They're community leaders in many cases. And so I think that's kind of the role that I would lean in. They're communicators, they're leaders, they are faith figures. And in many cases would be both organizationally very important and also culturally very important to a local community, particularly if religion plays a big role outside of that. So I think that's a big deal. And again, like a paladin, particularly one who's trained and interested, is probably somebody who might be really, really interested in protecting the community at large. So, you know, even if like there's not necessarily Arthurian or fantasy bent to it, I see those as potential roles for a paladin, which is cool. Peter from Tales from Elsewhere, what's up, dude? It's been a hot minute since I've gotten a question from you, so this is cool. What's an aspect of real paladins that is underrepresented in RPGs? But I'm going to give you two. Again, we've touched on it during the video. We just touched on it for Loxodon's question. But the role they play as community leaders and as community figures is, I think, vastly underrepresented for how important it was both historically and in the cultural background that informs what a paladin becomes. That, I'm going to say, is a huge deal. And the other one, I think, is the nuance, right? A paladin isn't just a fighter. They are, in many cases, a medic, a scholar, a theologian, and a church leader, a community leader. Those are definitely the two things. I think paladins get flanderized really hard. So, and I know I touched on that in the video, but I'll touch on it again now. Those, I think, are the key, critical, underrepresented points. St. Coria asks, what are your personal thoughts on the lawful good alignment restrictions of paladins in ye olden times? I actually kind of like it. So this is one of the things, St. Coria, that I've sort of come full circle on as both a game designer and a game player. I think there was a time where it was like, I didn't like restrictions on stuff. And the more experienced I get, and the more games that I run, and the more games that I make, I find that the restrictions breed creativity way more than one might expect. And I'll let you, I guess I'll elaborate, right? So if I just say anybody can be a paladin, I'm going to get a lot of different concepts on it. And some of them might be really good. Some of them might be really okay. But if I tell somebody, hey, you can be a paladin, but you have to work within these confines, a really creative player is going to work within those confines in ways that are really fresh and really interesting. I'm going to toss Brennan Lee Mulligan, who does not need my help at all, but I'm going to toss him a really some props. One of his paladin archetypes was a lawful good guy, but he was literally like a like a halfway home character. He was like an ex-rogue, and he was like, "Hey man, listen, like we don't got to do this today, right?" So he was kind of that guy. He's like, "I've been where you've been before," and I love that angle. It's still a lawful good angle, so to speak, if we're gonna use the D&D parlance, which I don't love the D&D parlance anyway, but we'll use it. But it's a really fresh take on it. So me personally, I actually kind of love the strictures that they put in place, because ultimately I think those restrictions breed a level of creativity and give an opportunity for people who are like who see those restrictions and know they can do more with those. I think is probably a good way of phrasing that. That's going to be the thing that I was talking about. And in general, if you were going to, again, I don't like D&D's alignment system. I don't think it works particularly well. But if you're going to, continue on with that parlance, I think neutral good paladins make a ton of sense. I even think chaotic good paladins make a ton of sense, so long as there is a very stringent and fervent and genuine level of devotion. I really don't see any way to like separate paladin from faith. Unless that's like a specific cornerstone of your game, right? Like a world without gods would be really interesting, because then who does the paladin swear their oaths to? Probably the community around them. And where does the paladin then get their power from? Probably the community around them. So like, unless you are doing something specifically playing around with that trope, like if you're just doing your standard fantasy fare, I think keep that faith angle pretty big. But I guess that's a long answer to a short question. I think it's decent, especially if you give people an opportunity to experiment within those confines, which I think is cool. Invalid Salad asks, how/when did Paladins decide between fighting in lances and squads and rolling together? IIRC, most of their prized effect on the battlefield was literal side-by-side cavalry charges in a line. That is called the Chronos, by the way. That's what that tactic is called. But the most frequently documented is fighting in lances with their men at arms and squires. I think it just depends, Invalid Salad, on like what time period you're talking about in the Middle Ages, right? So like obviously, yeah, originally it's called the Chronos, but it's literally just like that charge to sort of sweep things. But then you have stuff like the Hammer and Anvil, where the infantry will hold the line, the knights will essentially win on the flanks, and then start hammering from the back or the sides the enemy army, while the infantry continues to hold them in place. Thus the Hammer and the Anvil. It's a pretty tried and true cavalry tactic. So in terms of like how/when, I think warfare develops really gradually, right? Like obviously, we don't get like a professional medieval fighting force probably until Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden adopts it. But by that point we have arquebuses and like firearms and like actual artillery and other stuff going along with it. I think it's more of a case-by-case basis and a slow, gradual evolution in terms of like not fighting like that, or in sort of like fighting in smaller squads. I will say, to your question though, Invalid, even when they're fighting in one big giant line, they're still fighting with squires and men-at-arms. That doesn't change at all. You can watch our night video on that, but we talk about that, and the low fantasy video. Both of those have sections on like fighting with a retinue, which is exactly what knights would have done. So, Ignacio, I think most video games paint the paladin as having an oath to a vague religious power and secondarily to a crown. In D&D, my understanding of this is from BG3, honestly. They can make an oath to, well, different things like nature or social order. You can even be an evil and intimidating paladin with an oath to having a broken oath and being powerful, I guess. That's very true. Is there a legacy to the concept of paladins having strong promises to things that aren't a crown or a church? Ultimately, no. At least not historically. Again, we can stretch, Ignacio, what our definition of paladin is to kind of get there. But ultimately, I'm going to say no. At least not historically. Within pop culture, absolutely. But like historically, I don't think so. This concept is pretty cool, but does the idea maybe spread the concept too thin? What do you think? I do think it spreads it too thin, insofar as I don't want it all of the time. It's like, oh God, there's like a very specific type of Indian food that I like, but only in very limited quantities and only like once or twice a year. I'm blanking on the name of the food because it's all these crazy flavors and textures that all kind of go together. And it's kind of like that, right? Like I want that particular dish realistically, very rarely, but when I want that dish, nothing else in this world will satisfy me the way that dish does. I think that's kind of where I'm at on that concept. Again, I think we've talked about a bunch of different ways that you can experiment with Paladins, just in this Q&A section. So I think ultimately, yeah, you can spread it maybe a little too thin, but I do think it could be really interesting. I love the idea, though, again, of Paladins swearing an oath to the community and then their power coming from the people they protect is very interesting and appeals, I think, maybe to my power to the people, my beloved sense of community sort of thing. KMS for $. What is more important to a Paladin, personal moral code or their oath? I mean, in fantasy media, Paladins tend to be painted as Superman, goody two-shoes, lawful good, knights in shining armor. What would happen if the church is to decide to attack the kingdom and does not allow its missionaries into submission? Ooh, that's a great question. Genuinely curious, since religions tend to not have that big of an influence in the history of my country. That's very true. So what's interesting to think about there, I think it's going to vary, KM, from Paladin to Paladin. We have a couple cases, for example, of like Crusader knights, like either taking up arms against their brethren or like basically ensuring that their brothers got punished by the Catholic Church because of atrocities that they committed in the Holy Land during the Crusades. But those are exceptions to the rule. So I think just like with anything, when you have an organization that has an incredible amount of power, there are going to be Paladins who, or just, just in general, like when an organization has that much power, there's going to be people who are like, no, the buck has to stop here. It has to stop with me. And then there's going to be people who feel a certain type of way about it, but go through with it anyway. And that's true, not just for Paladins, but historically just for people in general. I feel like there will be some that break away and there will be some that are like, nope, this is my oath. I'm upholding it, even though the action itself is wrong. So, would be a fun to explore, though. New Poly Dad asks, what's the economic impact of Paladins in fantasy and the real world? I almost asked what the economic equivalent of a Paladin is, but that's more ideological than mechanical. I mean, I'll be honest, they're knights. Just in general, they're knights, right? A Paladin is a knight, right? Not all knights are Paladins, but all Paladins are knights, I would say, in some way, shape, or form, right? I think because we often fail to take into account that knights can be created not just by secular authority, but by religious authority too. So, like, for example, I could get knighted, which would be sweet. Shout out to anybody that wants to knight me. That would be sweet. I would love a knighthood. but ultimately, like, that's what it is, right? And Paladins occupy the same sort of functional economic base or economic role that a knight would, right? They ran fiefs, they ran estates, they derived value from the residents of those estates. If they didn't, and they were like purely church focused, New Polydad, they would have most likely gained that and derived that benefit from the tithe, which is about 5% of your income that would have gone to the Catholic Church, right? So the tithe would have been where they would have derived that. Now, in some cases, and this is part of the reason we have Lutheranism, which who knows if we'll ever get into like the split of the medieval Catholic Church into other religions. But like every modern Christian offshoot is an offshoot of the Roman Catholic Church. But like part of the reason for that is church officials sold indulgences, which is a very strange thing. But like, so, oh God, I can't believe we're talking about indulgences. Maybe this is another topic for another video, but just I'll break it down. I'll break it down as best as I can. So an indulgence is when the church sold your ability to get into heaven for money. And it sounds awful, right? The idea behind it started pretty good, where the idea behind it was there is a Catholic principle where it's not just faith. It is not just faith, but by works that you enter into heaven. Because the idea is you shouldn't just be allowed to pray and pay lip service. You have to go do good stuff in order to enter the kingdom of God. And so, very innocently at first, some people were like, well, if I donate a metric crap ton of money to charities and charitable organizations, if I build hospitals and homes for the poor and the sick, if I help feed the hungry, do I get into heaven that way? Which I think we can all agree, yeah, like if you spend your life and dedicate your fortune to caring for the downtrodden, that probably should buy you some good noodle points, right? But what happened is eventually some people are like, hey, if I give you the money to do this, that should have the same result, right? And it basically just turned into like court-sanctioned bribes. So that's another way that paladins could get their potential money. Could be interesting. Carl, from Carl Makes Stuff. Are there any non-European archetypes for the paladin? Yes. I guess like they're called the cataphracts in some places, but like Islam has like heavily armored, essentially knights. I'm blanking on the exact term for them. I will have to look that up later. But yes, Islam 100% has these, very, 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 very much so. And actually, the Kshatriya, which is the next caste under the Brahmin in India, are also a pretty good stand-in for this, right? Because they would have been heavily Hindu as opposed to heavily Catholic or heavily Muslim, and they would have occupied a very similar role. So, yeah, I think in India and in the Islamic world, I think you have two very good examples for a non-European archetype for paladin. So, may have been asked before, but when did the meaning of term paladin change from assistant warlord / seneschal to holy warrior? I think that. And this is tough. We're in the conjecture zone now, Carl. Conjecture zone. But I think that the germ of that idea is always there. It's always present because of Charlemagne's association with the Roman Catholic Church and with the Pope in general. So, is there a historical analog for the modern game definition of paladin? Yes, it's the knight, but it's the knight sort of, again, I think we've talked about this a bunch. The knight, the crusader, but it's all the stuff that goes along with it. What are the historical tropes that make a paladin? We talked about those. I could taste pop culture crusaders, a dash of Arthurian fan fiction, and the classic definition of ideal knight in there. What else? A healthy dose of the importance of the New Testament. I think it's really hard for non-Catholics and non-Catholic scholars, people who have not studied the impact of the Catholic Church on medieval history, which is one of the things that, like, obviously I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school and studied under Catholic scholars and like I did a lot of reading on it, right? It's kind of hard to like put into words the important theological break between New Testament and Old Testament ideology, to the point that like in a lot of Catholic scholarship, they refer to God as the Old Testament God and the New Testament God as almost as separate entities, which is crazy work to think about. But specifically the New Testament, I think, is a very, very, very important source of information with the Paladin, which I think is cool. So Luxan, adding on to Ignacio's question, to add on to a portion of this, do you think losing punitive archetypes for characters like the Paladin have impacted the way we view them in popular media? Yes. If so, what are your opinions on this impact? I think it's a double-edged sword. Which always sparks my favorite quote from Magic the Gathering, which is, why are people complaining about a double-edged sword? It's a sword with two edges. Which is, shout out my boy Kamal, an underrated fantasy character. In any case, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think you can't explore the nuance of a character like a Paladin, Loxo, without the only attack, only punitive, only fire, brimstone, Old Testament angle being downplayed. However, I think the issue is that a lot of people think it's like, oh, look at the cute Boy Scout. And it's like, yes, but the amount of atrocities that a paladin is willing to commit, particularly when they think they're in the right or when there's no other options, is frankly terrifying, and part of the reason you should probably be playing with safety tools or communication tools in your games, because, oh boy, do some of those Boy Scouts decide to go absolutely sicko mode, and by that I mean they just start unaliving people left, right, and center in some pretty horrific and brutal ways. So yes, it's a good thing because ultimately it removes the nuance, but I think in some ways it has defanged the Paladin. And made them like, oh, look at the cute golden retriever, and he's so nice, and he's so friendly, and it's like, yeah, but the paladins are terrifying. Like, objectively, like, they were terrifying. Like, the Teutonic Order specifically, holy god, those guys are so freaking scary. But yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. Masked Bandit asked, which of the paladin swords was the most hardcore, not counting Joyeuse? Also, did any older stories inspire old Charlie to basically anoint his old Nazgul, or his own Nazgul, or is he the first? So, I think in terms of that, like, I want to say Durandal because that's like the first Paladin sword. It's the precursor, but like, come on, like I grew up reading Arthurian myth and legend. It's Excalibur. It's got to be Excalibur. Like that sword's just, it's iconic. It is the sword, right? With that being said, though, did any older stories inspire Charlemagne to anoint his own Nazgul, which is, obviously his riders, his nine, his soldiers, his paladins, or is he the first? He's certainly not the first mass bandit. There is a massive, both Frankish and Saxon tradition of appointing bodyguards to a warlord in a way to protect them. So, fun fact, by the way, the best man tradition in Western weddings comes from a bride snatching tradition in Saxon culture. So, like, you didn't want your bride getting snatched the day of your wedding, and so your best man was literally your best man with a sword who you would have on the altar to protect your bride from getting bride snatched. So, certainly the warlords appointing their special bodyguards to their retinues is not a new phenomenon. I will say, though, I think Charlemagne is the one that gets the credit for it because, much like everything in the Middle Ages, Charlemagne kind of does it better longer than a lot of other folks, which is why he gets the credit and or the blame, I think, depending on how you want to look at it. Dionysus says, we hear a lot of horror stories about lawful good paladins not melding well with the common adventuring party. We need to steal this important relic, but our paladin oath is oath bound to never steal. That's a pretty interesting point, and I think I have a potential workaround, but I'm gonna finish reading the question here. What are some ways we can avoid this conflict, or better yet, make the conflict interesting while respecting all characters? God, Dionysus, this is why I love you, dude. This is such a great question. While respecting all characters involved in these interactions and still completing the objective, the story, the campaign, etc. So, as always, and again, part of the reason I will always stress communication tools is, this is something you want to have a conversation with outside of game with your players first and foremost. Be like, hey, look, I know you want to play a paladin. I know you've got these oaths. The oaths are important. I want you to take them seriously, but they cannot and should not derail how we work and what we do. And so I think that's interesting is like you can go about this a bunch of ways beyond that first conversation. So like one of the things you could do is you could say, all right, listen, you are oath bound never to steal, but it doesn't say that you have to prevent us from doing it. You could stand guard. You're also, presumably, oath bound to protect the weak. Okay, the person we're stealing this relic from is clearly oppressing the poor people in the town square that happens to be in front of the tower where we're stealing the relics from. So we just need you to go in, start causing trouble, swinging on people who are attacking the poor and the homeless. I don't know a single paladin that wouldn't want to do that. Are you kidding me? I get to swing on the corrupt and I get to do it for God? I'm in, right? Like if I'm a paladin, that's awesome. So giving them a role within a mission, or I think finding roles within a given set of parameters that allow them to keep their oath without worrying about it, I think is a huge deal. I think it's a great call. Beyond that, though, allowing a paladin some level of leeway, I think does matter, right? So, is it stealing if the relic was stolen it was stolen in the first place? If the relic was originally the property of, the village, well, just the aforementioned village, is it truly stealing to return it to its rightful owners? Ultimately, I would say no. And perhaps that paladin has that, I was going to say a come to Jesus moment, but come to whatever fantasy deity moment of theirs. But I think that's a really good way of approaching it, right? Find ways and angles to allow your paladin to not exploit their oath, but to engage with it theologically, I think is a huge deal. And ultimately, one that I think would lend itself to greater role-playing because, yeah, you want to have that conversation. And giving other players, particularly other players who might walk a faith bent, like a druid or a cleric, or, even a particularly, like, religious, just caster of any kind. I hate that I'm like drifting into D&D stuff because I'm like, we do system agnostic stuff, but like, what, who cares? But like having another player have that conversation about what faith looks like for them, and allowing a paladin to sort of broaden their own horizons about what faith means beyond a certain point is a really cool idea. So That would be how I would do it, Dionysus. And now we're going to go to the YouTube posts. Hello, YouTube post. American Orox asks, dost thou even smite brethren? I do, or I did, I should say. I find that I have been trying much harder I've always been a pretty agreeable person, I think. Pretty relaxed, pretty chill person. I have been told I have big golden retriever energy by a couple folks. I don't know if I agree with that, but, I find that I have smote in the past. I find that I try very hard to engage in conflict now in ways that do not involve smiting. But still involve conflict. You can be kind and nice and still not be conflict averse. I think that's my big struggle. So maybe the real smiting was the growth we made along the way, Orox. I don't know. Pelagius the Great asked, what are the different paladin archetypes besides Boy Scout? Field medic, community leader, religious theologian, scholar, philosopher, conqueror, crusader, weapon master, mentor. There's like a bajillion. Anything a knight could do and would do in the Middle Ages is an archetype for a paladin, and one I would encourage you to lean in on. My favorites are the mentor paladin, the paladin as this wise figure attempting to pass on knowledge and training and importance of those trainings to the next generation, hopefully to see them succeed where perhaps he and his brothers may have failed. I love that one. The theologian and scholar angle is one of my favorites because few people expect it, but I love the idea that like a paladin would be a scholar of their faith. Again, I think the healer angle is good because there is nothing more terrifying than somebody could unalive you viciously, and then instead they decide to help take care of the sick. That's a big flex. I like that a lot. Rob O'Feeney asked, what can separate the idea of the paladin from, say, the cleric? Or are the two just the same idea presented in slightly different fashions? Do both need to exist? I think this is an interesting idea. So in terms of what separates them, I think it's martial prowess and martial responsibility. You have, for example, clergymen who fought in the Crusades, particularly on the Hospitalier side, where you had like priests who eventually were expected to battle, right? Or in the Holy Roman Empire, you had bishops who were like warrior bishops or warrior priests. That's a Germanic thing, which is kind of cool. But I think martial responsibility and martial training winds up being a big deal in terms of the difference between a paladin and a priestly figure or a monk figure or an ascetic figure, right? Or are the two... So I don't think the two are the same idea presented in slightly different fashions. I think what they are is if you think about a church as an organism, like there are red blood cells and white blood cells, but they're both cells. They both perform, some not similar functions, but they both perform functions within the body that keep it alive, but those functions are different. So there's a lot of similarities, but the differences are very crucial to keeping the whole host alive. And I think that's kind of how I view the priest paladin or monk paladin, non-combatant religious figure and combatant religious figure, respectively. I think that's the best way to do it. Do both need to exist? I would say yes. We're going to get kind of dark for a second here. But, obviously, I used to teach in schools. I still work in a school. And right around a couple years ago, this idea of, arming teachers came up. And I've been against it my whole life because it's when you carry a weapon, you are carrying a weapon with the express purpose that eventually at some point you're probably going to use it. And I think it changes your demeanor. I think it changes your mindset. If you're a monk, a healer, a scholar, your focus is on those things and should be on those things. The second that you make fighting a core part of that identity, then a previous part of that identity is gone. It is stripped away. It is shaved away. And we know this is fact, at least about the monk-paladin divide, because what happened was the second you started arming clergy in the Holy Land, that's when things really started to heat up in terms of the founding of knightly orders like the Teutonic Knights, the Templars, and the Hospitalier, all of which went from performing more priestly duties, care of the sick, guarding of pilgrims, running of hospitals, and that it did not take long at all for them to turn into full combat units, essentially. So yeah, I think both do need to exist. You can't expect somebody's whole existence to be about the care and the protection of the downtrodden, or their and by that I mean their spiritual needs, their physical needs, their care, and then expect them to fight. That requires a different mindset, a different skill set, a different character of an order or an organization, so to speak. And our last one, Air's Battle Blade 732 asked, what's the difference between a paladin, a cavalier, a crusader, a templar, and or just a pious knight? So a paladin and a templar, I think, are basically just the same. They are individuals who have sworn holy oaths. In the paladin's case, they swore oaths. In the templar's case, they had very specific oaths. They're beholden to the church and to church organizations. They serve at the behest of a religious organization. A crusader is anybody that goes on crusade, truthfully, right? So templars were crusaders. But you had non-religious knights that were crusaders. You had Venetian and Genoese mercenaries that are technically crusaders. You had peasants who showed up with clubs and rags who are technically crusaders. That is, anybody who goes on crusade is a crusader. Now, did the Paladins, the Templars, the Hospitality, did they do it better than most? Yeah, of course, right? They're highly trained, well-funded, incredibly well-organized, had a robust strategic and secular bureaucracy backing them up. Of course they did it better, but they're all crusaders. And a pious knight is anybody who has and is interested in religion in general. You can be pious and not be a paladin because, again, you haven't sworn those oaths, you have not made those promises, you have not sworn to serve at the behest of an organization, a religion, or a faith in the same way that a paladin would. And I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A section. Again, folks, if you like this, the Patreon, $3 a month, get your name in the credits. $10 a month, you get a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else. You can't buy anywhere else. I make it special just for the Patreon members. Last month, we did Appalachian-themed index card role-playing games, which I'm really proud of. They came out really cool. So yeah, this month we're going to be cooking up something special. The $10 patrons are in the process right now of voting on what they want from me, which I'm kind of jazzed to do. It's kind of like working on spec, which I think is cool. So if you want to join that, I know it's, $10 a month is not nothing. But if you want to join it, that's there. And again, you can get all of our stuff, itch.io, Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, World of Game Design. Check out our sponsor as well. They were super nice. They were really great to work with. They're cool folks. So, but yeah, I think that's pretty much it, folks. Until next time, Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You guys are amazing. And yeah, I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.